On August 8, 2014, Scott Cawthon would publish Five Nights at Freddy's on Desura for the first time. 10 years later, the franchise has expanded into 18 games, more than 30 books, a movie with a sequel and most likely a threequel, and a massive collab coming next summer. But how can one series have such an impact? I mean, look at any other game and you won't find a fanbase as passionate as the FNAF community, or a lore that's as overly complicated as struggling to find out what is hidden inside a box. This week has been the most packed week ever when it comes to FNAF, from the Dead by Daylight collab, Secret of the Mimics announcement, to Into the Pits release, and there's only a few examples of the amazing stuff being worked on behind the scenes. Today, we're celebrating the 10-year anniversary of FNAF, and what better way than to take a step back and look at everything this franchise has given us over the past decade. Five Nights at Freddy's was published on August 8, 2014, exactly 10 years ago today. Initially, the game was one of Scott's efforts to bring in a few extra dollars per month to help support his family. He'd realised that making shorter games meant that he could make them faster instead of committing 2 years at a time to one game, and FNAF was one of those projects. Scott didn't ever expect the game to take off, but it did. In his own words, he believed that all the right ingredients were there. The animatronics had come to him naturally, with Freddy, Bonnie and Chica all being quick and easy to decide. However, when it came to Foxy, Scott had some trouble deciding what animal he should be. Foxy was initially going to be a beaver, but once Scott realised that it was too similar to Chipper from one of his older games, he decided to go with a fox. Lore-wise, Scott definitely did not have all of the story planned out, but he did know that the story to FNAF 1 was part of something bigger. By the time the game had calmed down, Scott had left things open-ended, resulting in theorists like MatPat to step in and try to solve the lore themselves. With the undeniably major success of Five Nights at Freddy's, Scott went to work on a sequel. This time, the game would have more of an industrial feel to it, and it was meant to be a lot more chaotic than its predecessor. On November 11th, 2014, Scott would publish Five Nights at Freddy's 2 on Steam. Interestingly enough, the game was set for a release date of December 25th, but Scott had finished the game early and released it early as well. FNAF 2 began to explore more aspects of the story, including the Bite of 87 and the Purple Guy. The game was different from the first, but still retained the iconic mascot horror of the first one. Scott decided to add mini-games to further expand on the story rather than having the lore just handed to the player to fit in order. During development, the game would go through multiple different stages, including cut content such as the toxicity meter to stop the player from keeping the mask on forever. This was later replaced by mechanics such as the puppet's music box and Foxy's immunity to the mask. As stated in the first Dorco Scott interview, FNAF 2 was a time of stress in Scott's life. Whilst it did still have good memories, he would not like to revisit that time. The game brought a wider fan base to Scott, and also established the rise of many of today's big FNAF content creators, including Dorco, MatPat and Fusion Z Gamer. March 2nd, 2015. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 was different from the first two. Scott wanted it to feel personal, something more than a simple night guard working the 12 to 6 shift. The only animatronic in FNAF 3 that can kill you is Springtrap, and for good reason. As the lore stands, Springtrap is the father of the player, Michael Afton, making the rabbit none other than our purple guy, William Afton. The Phantom animatronics are a symbol of Mike's dramatic past, which is why he can't die to them, but they can still give him a good scare. At the time of FNAF 3, Scott was beginning to be driven more by criticism from the previous games, and he wanted to make this third game stand out. In his mind, it was the end of a trilogy. However, people were unhappy with Springtrap's jumpscare. One of the scariest designed animatronics at the time only gets to pop in your face before you get the game over menu. It basically contradicted Springtrap's entire design. Scott couldn't just lead the series there at 3, he wanted to make one final entry, one that was unbelievably scary. On July 23rd of that same year, Scott will publish FNAF 4 with one goal: make the perfect final chapter in the FNAF franchise. It needed to be scary, filled with story, but also have a satisfying ending. FNAF 4 released at an awkward time. It was initially planned for Halloween, but Scott, being a troll as always, decided there was no point in waiting. The mechanics of listening to the game helped massively in amplifying the jump scares effects on the player. Not knowing whether there was an animatronic in front of you before turning on the flashlight, waiting to hear them breathe before you decide to close the door or not. That is the true terror of FNAF 4. The lore of FNAF 4 is quite complicated. To this day, we still don't know all of its aspects, but one moment that caught everyone's attention was the Bite of 83. Initially sparking some debate within the community, people eventually settled down and agreed that this was not the Bite of 87, and rather a separate bite altogether. FNAF 4 ended with the iconic scene of the box, presumably with the crying child's death. Some things are best left forgotten forever. I'm not going to talk about all of the books in this video, but I am going to donate a small section of time to the Silver Eyes. After FNAF 4, everyone was wondering what was next. Was the franchise finally complete? Or was there more that Scott could still add? And no, we're not talking about FNAF World. The Silver Eyes was the first FNAF book and a big step for the franchise into the world of novels. Originally creating some divide within the community, as all things do, Scott would later clarify that the games and the books were separate realities, both canon and both not. It was a way for another story to be told in the FNAF universe, a what-if story, if you will. And it worked. The books became a hit with the fanbase, keeping them occupied and hungry for more. Over a year had passed since the last game, and FNAF 5, better known as Sister Location, was finally released on October 7th, 2016. Sister Location was meant to ground the story, to put it back on track. Scott knew the game had to have a technological feel to it, and he most certainly succeeded. The game would contain familiar faces, but also new ones. Gone were the simple times of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica and Foxy. Now, there was Baby, Laura, Freddy and Foxy. The way I see it, he felt that in giving players new animatronics to face, it would add a sense of unpredictability. No one was really sure what these new mechanical monsters were capable of, how they worked. Scott also wanted to change other aspects of how the game felt during playthroughs. The inclusion of voice acting was another big step up from FNAF 4 to Sister Location, and it was definitely worth it too. Having real people speak things to you rather than reading it off the screen made the experience much more scary. Scott wanted to lean slightly into the sci-fi territory with this game too, from Enid being a sort of amalgamation of the fun times to the Scooper and Remnant. Another year and a bit later, one of the most lore-significant games in the series came along. Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, also known as Five Nights at Freddy's 6. Scott finally wanted to have a satisfying conclusion to the series, and he wanted to do it in a way that none of the other games had done. Whilst all the other games had been teased with screenshots or renders or some hidden images, Scott was completely silent when it came to FNAF 6. This game wasn't to profit off, but rather to put the franchise at rest. As a result, the fanbase got quite annoyed at Scott that he wasn't communicating with them nor hinting at any new projects, but it was the way it had to be. And then it ended. All the animatronics went up in one big fire, killing them all. Except, it wasn't over yet. Ultimate Custom Night is probably the single most crazy idea Scott has ever had. 50 animatronics, all with a range of 1 to 20 AI levels. That's just a tad too much, but still, people, namely Dorco, persevered and still managed to achieve the impossible and beat 50-20 mode. On June 27, 2018, the world set eyes on what is believed to be Afton's personal hell for the very first time. Scott knew he wanted this game to be big. It needed to be an add-on to FNAF 6 to show the aftermath in a specific way of storytelling. Scott had initially intended the game to have 40 animatronics, but the slots filled up too quickly and there were still too many characters left out. Even if he added another row, there'd still be too many animatronics not included, so he just kept adding and adding and adding, and he was able to find some fitting game mechanics for each animatronic. The development of Ultimate Custom Night was also a time of learning for Scott. One of his biggest issues with FNAF 6 was that he wasn't able to utilise some of the graphic features to their full potential, and with this game Scott was able to rectify that. With the release of FNAF Help Wanted, Scott was getting comfortable with letting others work on the franchise, and so began the era of Steelwall Studios. Steelwall is an independent game development company, of which Scott has trusted for around 5 years at this point, and during their time in FNAF, they've so far made both VR games, Security Breach, Ruin, and the recently announced Secret of the Mimic game coming next year. FNAF Help Wanted was a big step forward in the gameplay and the lore. It was an opportunity for another developer to have their shot at it and change it in a way that made more sense to them. The VR aspect of the game also had an impact of this too, Glitch Trap. As a digital bunny rabbit killer, it made sense that he'd be hiding around a VR game, and the fact that Help Wanted was also an in-universe game only further amplified that. Help Wanted was also the first FNAF game to be given a DLC, The Curse of Dreadbear. Fast forward to the 2020 PlayStation Showcase and we get to the announcement of FNAF Security Breach. This game was a very big step up from Help Wanted. It was the first fully free-roam FNAF game. Although the game wouldn't release until December 2021, the community would keep getting teasers for the game and the hype was bigger than ever. And then it released. Initial reviews were good, but soon after, people began to notice things that didn't belong in the game. It was as if the game had been rushed. Clearly, a lot of the game had been changed during development, and the story looked vastly different than what it could have been. As explained during the second Dorco Scott interview, Scott tried to make Steelwolf put certain things in certain places for players to put together, rather than just telling them the lore up front, and Steelwolf felt that it was their job to connect it in a way that made sense, which resulted in Security Breach not making sense. Then came Security Breach's DLC, Ruin. Ruin was an attempt to fix the mistakes that Security Breach made, whilst also adding on a new chapter to the story, which he did quite well. Up until Security Breach, William Afton had always been thought of as the main villain of FNAF, the big bad that would always come back no matter how many times he burned him. But the end of Ruin showed that the Mimic had taken his place as a new antagonist. Ruin was also significantly scarier than base Security Breach. Instead of having big flashy lights, Ruin's version of the Pizzaplex had been left to rot for what seemed like decades, resulting in a darker, more ominous atmosphere. It did what Security Breach couldn't and presented a well-thought story that had plenty of time to grow into something more, rather than change into something completely different. The movie was the next big FNAF project. Releasing on October 27, 2023, the movie had been in development for over 8 years at that point, and it was worth it. Whilst critics didn't really rate the film well, the movie went on to make over $250 million worldwide. The film was meant for the enjoyment of the fans, rather than for everybody. Scott said that he wanted the first movie to be similar to the first game, and the second movie to be similar to FNAF 2, and so on. On December 14, 2023, FNAF Help Wanted 2 was released, and it was definitely a step up from the original Help Wanted, both in visuals and in storytelling. It expanded on the lore of Glitch Trap and Vanny, while also hinting at the Mimic too. The game itself was much bigger than its predecessor, with way more levels than Help Wanted 1. Some might consider this game as the pinnacle of modern FNAF. And now we get to this week. I'm not going to do a section on Into the Pit or 5 Laps of Freddy's, because they're not out at the time of recording, and I wanted to get this video up on the 8th. This week has been completely crazy, with all the movie updates, the second Scott interview with Dorco, the Joy of Creation demo, My Pop Goes, the announcement of Secret of the Mimic, and I'm sure Into the Pit will be just as amazing once we get our hands on it. But there we go, that's the entire history of FNAF. You may have noticed I didn't mention games like FNAF World or Freddy in Space, mainly because they're not part of Scott's journey into FNAF, nor are they that significant of titles. But it doesn't mean they should be disregarded as not part of the FNAF series. Thank you everyone for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed today's video, and happy FNAF Day.